Well, welcome everyone. This is your host, Adam Coleman. We're talking a little bit more about the key checklist items that people should focus on when it comes to personal finances. So today I have Doug Tees, who is a certified financial planner with the Jason Howell Company in Virginia. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Great to be back again, Adam.
Well, appreciate you coming on to share a little bit of your wisdom here. But before we jump into the details of these client check-ins that we're going to talk about in more detail, can you share a little bit about your process in terms of how often you're meeting with your clients each year?
Sure. There's a specific onboarding process that we go through with new clients that's a little more intensive. But once somebody is in the fold and a part of the regular process, we typically try and meet with everyone at least semi-annually. So we set them up in the spring and in the fall to kind of go through seasonal checklists and what's going on for them and stay up to date.
Nice. Okay. So we'll touch on this a little bit more detail in terms of what's happening in each of those seasons. But I guess each year I also do an annual mortgage review for my clients, which kind of expands into more of a personal finance checklist. It's kind of gravitated towards that way. But so I'm kind of curious to hear your thoughts on things that I may have missed on my list, and also if there's specific times of the year that you might focus on these. So I've got 12 different items. Really, the last two are more summarizing of kind of having your annual mortgage review and having a financial review each year. Obviously, in your case, it's every 6 months, which is great. The other items I've got would be creating a monthly budget, or at least updating a monthly budget, replenishing an emergency fund, or again, creating one if you don't have one, unfortunately. A big one is obviously tax prep. So just preparing for, filing taxes and then long-term tax planning strategies. There's other things that you might want to do on a yearly basis there. Updating a plan to pay off your debts. If you still have consumer debt, obviously creating some sort of debt management plan. Updating retirement contributions every year. Obviously, we have updated IRS regulations and contribution limits, so keeping that updated is good. I always suggest a credit report. Check that every year just to make sure that you're on top of that, preferably monitoring that on a more regular basis, but bare minimum, checking that every year. Reviewing insurance coverages, both life, disability, long-term care, health. Obviously, this time of the year seems to be like a big one for health insurance because that's usually when the time to actually create all those plans. The next one will be asset allocations. So always good to check those on a regular basis to see if there's any rebalancing. And then the last couple would just be updating your financial goals to kind of keep track of short and long-term goals. And then the big one is obviously estate planning, which may not necessarily be an annual review, but it's always good to maybe keep an update on that. So, are there specific times of the year for any of those items that you would suggest people focus on in particular?
Yeah, I think some of the tax related stuff, you've got kind of a cadence, or at least we do, of two different times. One is just the tax filing stuff, and that's kind of the often too late, except for maybe some Roth and IRA contributions that you can do up until tax filing. But then in the fall, it's a great time for some tax planning, checking in. Okay, were my withholdings right? Am I in coasting into a good filing season later on? Also looking at things like, all right, did I have a very high income year? And am I inclined philanthropically? Do I give a lot? Is this a good year for maybe a donor advised fund where I can bunch up a lot of my giving over future years, get the deduction this year when I have a much larger income, improve my after tax with things that I need to do within the calendar year. So things like that. The one area within that we hit on that a lot of folks don't think about, but is kind of a part, I guess, of the overall planning, is around like family governance, which is, in our view, is having those conversations with family members, especially spouses with young or growing children, where oftentimes one of them takes the hat of the finances. And so at least on an annual basis, kind of getting back together and saying, hey, this is where we are. This is where we are along with our goals. And oh, by the way, this is where everything is, just in case something happens, those kind of things. And then also engaging as your kids get older, finding age appropriate ways of engaging them in that conversation overall about what do we have? What is it for? Why are we saving instead of spending, and why are we spending when we choose to? Those kind of things to help instill the both the values as well as the knowledge about how finances work and how a family can manage finances with goals of providing for today as well as tomorrow.
Nice. Anything else that you find that's more seasonal, or is it really just as long as you hit those things sometime in the year, you're doing pretty good?
Yeah, well, topically, we like to hit, and we'll get to this, I guess, in a second when we kind of talk about what we hit on. We tend to cover the same topics, but then do different focuses depending on the time of the year. Like from an income perspective, we want to understand things, and we typically focus that on in the spring. But in the fall, when we're talking about open enrollment and things like that that are seasonal around that time, required minimum distributions for folks who are in that season of life, those kind of things we want to focus in on at that particular time of year.
So, and it's a good segue. So maybe walk us through your plan and your setup with your group. So I know you said semi-annually. What's happening in each of those meetings, and what exactly is getting discussed?
Sure. So we kind of follow a structure of 7 areas of financial planning, and that's based on my business partner, Jason Howell, his book, The Joy of Financial Planning. And so we have it broken out into these 7 areas. And the first one is harmony or family governance. And we talk a little bit about, okay, how are you structured in that way? And then enough, which is a broad category. It's earning, saving, spending, and taxes. And so we cover those items as well with a deep dive depending on the time of the year. We talk about balance, which is the debt versus savings. What are you earning on interest versus what are you paying out from your debt? And that's where some of the things you talked about for a debt repayment plan and those kind of things might come in. Safety, which is all of the insurances you talked about. And as we mentioned in the fall, it's all about open enrollment a lot of times for folks. That's the typical timing. Some people are off of that, and then legacy planning, which is estate planning and philanthropy. So talking about what is your goal to leave behind, what do you want to do today versus tomorrow, and do you have the documents in order and in the appropriate way to support those goals and ambitions. And then we have a category of opportunity, which is really around investing. So how are we focusing on building assets, both taxable, tax advantaged, alternative, all of those, different investment categories that support the goals of the individuals we serve. And then finally, we have a category of time. Are you doing things today that will promote your health and well-being over the span of your life, as well as thinking about what will retirement look like? And we all hear stories about people who get to retirement and their life was 100% work and they are not happy, they just so being able to help people kind of frame out, hey, start on what you think you want to do in your retirement. How do you integrate that today? How do you make your life whole instead of in separate chunks? Like, this is my full work life and then this is my retirement life. People don't work that way, but a lot of times they're so focused on the day-to-day and earning and building their nest egg and everything that when they get there, they're like, what the heck was it all for? So really just trying to help them work through that. So there's topics that come up on that as well.
That's a lot. So how long are these meetings happening? If they're only twice a year, I guess, what does this look like?
Yeah, and those are broad categories. So we really do tailor it for the individual. So there's some things that matter more for affluent folks in their 30s than it matters when, to somebody in their 70s and 80s in retirement. So It's definitely, you flex and move within those categories. We reserve an hour for the meeting, and there's often an hour of prep and maybe a half an hour of work afterwards. So there's a chunk of time dedicated to it. And I'll tell you the other thing, the wild card is we start the conversation out with, what's new with you? What's changed since our last conversation? And sometimes
that can derail things quite a bit.
Yes, yeah, that can take things on a wild tangent, whether job changes in the offing or, hey, we made this major life decision. So we end up tailoring it to the individual as well as to the time period. So we get through the agenda typically, and for folks who are kind of cruising along and was like, hey, the last 6 months kind of the same. Okay, well, let's just make sure these things are lined up appropriately. Let's give you some updates from our side, and they can be pretty efficient as well.
Right. What does it look like for the pre-planning piece for the client side? Like, do you give them any information ahead of time, or is it really more just on the call that you're getting stuff from them? Or is there like a pre-planning checklist? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, typically most of our clients are used to kind of the cadence and know what to expect. So we don't ask for a lot ahead of time unless there's something that's held up from the prior meeting. Like, hey, make best use of our time. I know we asked for these things. We missed this one piece. Can you send it over?
Right.
But most of the time we jump in and we just cover whatever carried over from the prior session, if there is anything, and build from there. And then usually there's a follow-up of saying, hey, can you drop me these documents, or we have an action item to update a beneficiary or something like that.
Gotcha. Anything else that you touch on, maybe not necessarily with everybody, but are there certain key items that you want to focus on with anybody else?
Yeah, so depending on the individuals, there are things like health savings accounts, right? And from your checklist, diving into some of the details of that. So if somebody has a health savings account, most of our folks, we advise, if they have the cash flow to support it, to pay their medical expenses out of cash flow and build that
Right.
health savings account. But at the same time, we also want them to keep track of what they've spent, because whenever they decide to claim those funds, they've got support from 2018, 19, 20, what they spent, so that they can take those funds out tax-free in whatever subsequent period that they would like to. So things like that, making sure they're tracking those. The beneficiary piece, it comes up because, okay, did you put a will or a trust in place? Do we need to change either the ownership of the accounts? We also check with folks, hey, you've got individual accounts out there that maybe one spouse has, they might divide their funds and each spouse has their own checking. Okay, do you have transfer on death, payable on death set up with the banks so that you don't have to go through probate if something happened? So those kind of things. There's a lot of individual items that come up. And then certainly we touched on the giving and the donor advised fund, just tracking and understanding what is your profile for giving, what is your area of interest, what opportunities do we need to keep our eyes open for, what assets do you have that we should keep an eye on. If you've invested in Nvidia before the massive surge, hey, maybe that's the security you want to actually put into the donor advised fund, so you can avoid capital gains and take advantage of the taxes. So it's all about optimization and just kind of knowing who they are, where they are, what's important to them, and being able to check in and just making sure that they're making incremental progress over each 6-month period.
Nice. Does it ever deviate too much from the semi-annual plan, or is that pretty much what everybody's on at this point?
Most people stick with that, but life happens, and so we are ready to parachute in whenever. Okay, yeah, we're up and taking a new job and moving to a different state. Help us find the right person for a mortgage. Help us identify what we should be doing and selling, and where we can draw funds if we need to put a larger down payment, or do we keep our home in this state and rent it out? All of those kind of things. So instances like that come up all the time. So we're always available. The cadence of the semi-annual is to make sure that we stay on track for those periods of relative calm. And so that if for whatever reason they didn't think of us when change did happen, that we have a check-in before it gets too far off course, where we can make adjustments and dive in and be of service.
Nice. Well, anything else you wanted to run through on this one? Any other items that you think are helpful, even for a DIY person that doesn't have a financial planner? Anything else they should be focused on?
Sure. And I think you touched on it with your checklist, but there are things too, thinking ahead about larger purchases. Most people think of saving up for holiday spending or things like that, or a car, but also vacations and weddings and knowing what's out there. Certainly debt is a big piece. And we're finding that for families who have student loans, with all the chaos of what was and wasn't going to happen, checking in on what plans are available. This new SAVE plan that came out after the forgiveness was nixed, that's a phenomenal plan for folks who are eligible for it. So just making sure people understand and are checking in on those items, because it does change over time. Also, just taking the temperature and saying, hey, nobody really cared about where you kept your cash 2 years ago, because nobody was making money anywhere.
It matters now.
Yeah, it matters now. And it took a couple of meetings for some folks to switch, but it's like, this is real money that can happen. And if you're just not keeping an eye on it and checking in on it, the tides change a little bit, and it helps to have kind of an organized checklist, like the list of items you had, to make sure, okay, have I thought about this? Is there something different out there that I should be tuned into and making tweaks on?
Perfect. Well, no, this has been really good information. I'm going to go and update my list a little bit and tweak it a little bit now that I've talked to you as well. If anybody would like to know more about you and your group, what's the best way to find you?
You can find us at jasonhowell.com. That's JSONHOWELL.com. And be happy to chat with anybody if you want to reach out to us from there.
Perfect. Well, Doug, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Adam, always a pleasure talking with you. Thank you.
Same here. Thanks.
All right, take care.